All right, we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, and thank you all for joining. I'd like to welcome everyone to week 9 of the 2024 Watershed Wednesday series. Most of you know me, but if you don't, I'm Emily Decar. I'm the Agricultural Coordinator for the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. Watershed Wednesdays are hosted by the Upper Susquehanna Coalition and the Otsego County Conservation Association. We'll be holding sessions every Wednesday through November 20th, so we do just have a couple left this year. The full schedule is posted on our website and Facebook page. You can also sign up for email announcements on the USC website under the Watershed Wednesdays tab. The sessions are recorded and can be accessed on the USC website at a later date. They'll also be posted to the Facebook page. Probably by tomorrow, this one will be up on Facebook and the website. So to get things started, our presenter today is JJ Cathy. JJ is the Resiliency Planting Coordinator in the Bureau of Forest Resource Management, Division of Lands and Forests, and has experience working in invasive species management, greenhouse operations, volunteer coordination, data processing, and emergency preparedness from work at nonprofit organizations in the private sector and at New York State DEC. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in geography from SUNY New Paltz and SUNY Albany. So JJ is going to give you an update on New York statewide reforestation plan. We will hold questions till the end, unless she asks for any during her presentation. But otherwise, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or at the end, if you want to come off mute to ask a question, feel free. Other than that, JJ, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I like that little bio, like hearing that with me in the room. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm just trying to get trees in the ground. It's but I guess there's a lot of different factors that go into that. So, um, glad I had the trajectory that I had. Cool. I see some familiar names already on the list. I see Jessica and Danielle and Scott, and would not be surprised if there's some other folks who have seen some of this material already. So if you have been sort of tuned into the reforestation plan process, and sorry for any repeats, but as Emily mentioned, we should have some time for discussion at the end, and that's really what I'm looking for is, this is such a huge, broad project that, I think it's a little bit more lucrative to just see what people's thoughts are, what people's questions are. So I'll try to give a broad overview really quick of just, I titled this presentation Reforestation in New York State. My charge as Resiliency Planting Coordinator is to come up with the reforestation plan, which I'll talk about, but there's, a few more angles that our statewide goals are coming from on that. So I'll cover all of those things. Cool. So yeah, so again, those folks who have heard me speak before, I'll sound like a broken record to give you, the entire sort of like cradle to grave situation for our reforestation goals in New York State. Everything starts with the Climate Act in 2019. So the Climate Act is our impetus to start working towards carbon neutral in New York State. So for the most part, we're looking at a lot of changes to the energy sector, scaling up renewable energy at this really unprecedented rate and reaching zero emissions. But there's, this prediction that about 15% of New York State's emissions are going to be locked into difficult to decarbonize sectors. So they're not going to be so easy to scale down or transfer to renewables. So there's this call to action to increase carbon sequestration in order to hit that net zero for all those sort of nooks and crannies of emissions we can't reach. And for that, forests are sort of the best solution that we can implement on the landscape to increasing carbon sequestration. So that's the big picture. So that Climate Act came out in 2019. The Climate Act, the CLCPA, Climate Act, those are the same. The scoping plan that sort of addresses how we're going to actually implement what's set forth in the Climate Act. This came out in 2022, and that is where the impetus for the reforestation plan came about. So this is the direct text right from the scoping plan that pretty much justifies what my role is here at DEC. And so this one action item is to develop a statewide reforestation and afforestation plan. And all it says here, I highlighted some pieces that will be setting ambitious and collaborative goals, spanning across all types of agencies and organizations. And then it gets down into all different types of practices here as well: tree planting, tree regeneration, tree maintenance. So we're looking at this spectrum of participation of different groups, different ways to regenerate forest. So I just want to point out, I guess, that it's not necessarily a DEC policy that we're coming up with. It's a statewide call to action for any entity that could brush up against tree planting or forest regen. And we're not just looking at tree planting, we're looking at any ways to improve and support forest regeneration as well. So that could be restoration of degraded lands. So yeah, so we'll be talking about that more. But the numerical goal baked into this is an ambitious 1.7 million acres for forest establishment, including all those acres where maybe it's not a brand new forest, but you're doing some restoration work. So we have 1.7 million acres by 2040. So that's my charge. I come on about a year ago, and start to figure out what a good path forward to get to that mark is. Um, so that's around last fall that I come on to start dealing with the 1.7 million acres, coming up with a plan for that. DEC sends this up to the powers that be in the governor's office, and it comes back down through the state of the state announcement in January of 2024, with this call to plant 25 million trees by 2033. So that still, reinforces the need for tree planting, but as I'm sure many, practitioners on the call know, the stem count changes some things about how we're going to go about this goal. Um, so this is my fun self-indulgent slide. Just reiterating, this is a time for an intensive statewide campaign for the replacement of forests, and we should all be working together in a coordinated fashion to replace our rapidly disappearing forests. So if that sounds good to everybody, then I'll just let you know you just agreed with the last reforestation planning group that DEC hosted, and that was this is from conference, a pamphlet from 1922 in Albany. So that's a little bit more fun in person because I could get people to say like, oh yeah, I totally agree with that. That's so fun. Well, it turns out, this is something that we actually did 100 years ago, is my point. So when I first came into this role, folks were saying, wow, first ever like statewide reforestation plan, but that's actually not true. So we had about 100 years ago this call to improve regeneration and plant up more new forests, all under the guise of timber needs for the state and wood utilization. So I have some screenshots here of what that policy looked like, how closely together we planted monocultures and things like that. So there's some precedent for it, but we've learned a lot since then. Our objectives have changed since then. All of the socioeconomic context around this has changed since then, but it's technically not the first time. So I thought that was pretty cool. 'Cause trees are just on a different timeline than, bureaucracy and then people. So something fun to note. But I do want to touch on the difference between that 25 million tree goal and the Reforestation Plan 1.7 million acre goal. That's been coming up a lot. So the 25 million tree goal, as I just mentioned, it came from the governor's state of the state announcement. Um, it came from DEC's call to say, hey, we should do some more reforestation. And then there were some external agencies also into trees. And a lot of the things that came up in those asks included, climate adaptation, things like engaging youth, things like building climate resilience in urban heat islands and urban areas and environmental justice areas, and addressing flooding with trees and just using trees as a natural solution, more so to adapt to a changing climate. Um, and the reason I bring that up, I'll just toggle over to how that differs from the reforestation plan. This came from, as I mentioned, the Climate Act that really is just looking at carbon. And so it's not necessarily looking so much at climate adaptation. How do we make an area more livable by putting trees there? It's more aimed at mitigation. So how do we get trees anywhere within state lines to start sequestering more carbon to reduce our footprint? So that's the difference there. But obviously, trees are trees. We need both. There's numerous benefits. So this is really good that we have the 25 million tree reinforcement. So I talked about the root of each of these different goals. This what we're calling here on this slide elements. Because 25 million is a stem count, we're counting all trees planted. And for the reforestation plan, we're counting all practices that support regeneration, like I mentioned. So it could be an acre planted that was previously an abandoned farm field or something like that. And it could be managing deer or something like that too. Putting up a slash wall. We love talking slash walls. Managing competing vegetation. anything that would support natural regen that wouldn't otherwise occur if we hadn't intervened. Um, and then another part of this here that's probably on folks' minds is that 25 million trees came with some very specific funding with specific eligibility guidelines to develop a database in order to track this stuff, which we currently do not have. Community reforestation grants, so that's so that we can get some tree planting done within municipalities. So those are probably not going to be high acreage, but more higher impact for communities. And some modernization for the Saratoga Tree Nursery, which if folks are aware, is our last tree nursery in New York State, our only tree nursery, our oldest. I might have heard hearsay it's the oldest in the country. It's up there because it participated right in that first reforestation plan 100 years ago. So that's where the funding came from for 25 million trees for the reforestation plan. It's really more so just delineating a path forward. If the funding is to become available, then here's what we would do so that we're prepared for when those opportunities pop up. Um, so I'll talk more about how we would spend that funding and our goals and actions. And then one more thing that I'll mention is that I'm the coordinator for the reforestation plan, but DEC was able to get an Excelsior Fellow to coordinate 25 million trees, which is a little different. It's more of an outreach sort of style initiative. And so we have a coordinator for that whole program, and her name's Annabelle Gregg. I can share her contact information too. We work obviously very closely together, a lot of overlap. Yeah. Sorry to be speeding through. Just really want to get to the point where I can show you guys some of the goals we're coming up with for the reforestation plan. Meat and potatoes of the plan. Yeah, so this is a little graphic actually that Annabelle made. Take this number with a giant block of salt, but that 680 number came from the Climate Act scoping plan that I showed you. 1.7 million acres would be approximately 680 million trees is what was written in there. That's only true if you're applying like a standard, something like, 10-foot spacing, and of course the fact that all of those acres would have to be planted brand new, which isn't the case, right? If we put up a deer fence and we get regen, then, we're not counting those stems individually. So huge grain of salt, but roughly, if we're looking at, planting something like 1.7 million acres, it might equate to this many green squares where each square represents 20 million trees, and 25 million is a very small piece of that. So we really like to just consider it a way that we can jumpstart this broader initiative, get people excited and interested and engaged in all these different aspects of the pipeline, from production to, workforce development to outreach and, information sharing to outplanting and data. And so this is just really sending the signal. So I just mentioned, I just used that buzzword of the reforestation pipeline, which has been helpful to me in understanding this whole process. So this is a figure from a really wonderful paper called Challenges to the Reforestation Pipeline in the United States. It came out in 2021 in anticipation of some of this climate legislation. And, it gives you a little bit fuller of a picture of all these different pieces we have to look at, which I really like thinking about in terms of the reforestation plan. And I think sometimes the 25 million tree kind of soundbite is at risk of leaving out some of these pieces. It sounds like you just get 25 million trees and you huck them in the ground and you walk away. Not the case if the goal is really forest establishment, right? So it all starts with seed, with that cute little acorn silhouette there. There is a national seed shortage. There have been more regional and statewide seed shortages that have been reported by, everybody in production, but, our Saratoga Tree Nursery is often, struggling to get enough seed to grow out keep their sort of baseline numbers going. So that's been like a number one bottleneck, which is really interesting. And maybe not everybody working in forestry understands that earlier part of the pipeline, right? So there's this bottleneck right at seed. There's workforce that goes into that. You need trained seed collectors. You need to figure out what species are where and how they're responding to climate change. You might want to run seed production areas or SPAs right in here. You might want to certify those seeds so you can make sure you have a good read on the genetics, things like that. Then there's the nursery, other bottleneck, the production, where those seeds go to be propagated, grown out to a size where they can reach outplanting. That's mostly a workforce challenge. And then outplanting is everything from, the transportation of getting the trees where you want them to be planted, finding the sites, finding the personnel to make that planting happen. And then post-planting obviously goes into that, the maintenance and the monitoring, which really falls off the radar for a lot of outreach and a lot of, like funding. And I think folks here are aware that, it's the less glamorous part, but if you don't have that, you won't have the survivability. So I'm hoping to really emphasize the importance of monitoring and maintenance throughout this plan as well. 25, let's not plant 25 million trees, let's grow 25 million trees is what I've been saying over and over again. So this is a little planning process update from me. We have our last, so this Friday is our next planning process update call. And I actually have, ooh, did I think to, yes, I did, to copy paste the links here. I have a plan dashboard where folks can see, information that we've already sort of run through on the plan, upcoming meetings, past meeting recordings, and things like that. That link is only viewable for people who have it, so you can't search it up or anything like that. But if you'd like to, if you know other folks who would be interested in receiving that update and participating and commenting on the plan as we bring it together, I just wanted to shout that out. I will say though, this is a pretty similar presentation, but if you want a deeper dive, then we have that on November 8th and the 15th. I'm not sure why the 8th didn't show up on here, but there's a chance it could be canceled due to extenuating circumstances at the agency, but definitely the 15th. So more information at that link. Okay. So yeah, this says as time allows, I can start to get into the goals and objectives that we have. And I do want to make sure that we have some time for questions, so I'll really run through them quick. And folks can ask, about the pieces that interest them the most. Very glad I caffeinated as much as I did this morning. So goal one, we have these nested for folks who are familiar with FEMA's incident command system. We're using that framework, goal, objective, strategy, action to kind of narrow down what we're going to do. So right now you're seeing the really broad goal, the objective direction you want to head in, the strategy, basic, sort of choosing, how to approach tactics for that objective. So our first goal is to optimize and support existing reforestation programs. So we have a lot that's already going on throughout the state that could be more coordinated, more efficient, or be backed by a greater sort of public awareness and understanding of how reforestation comes into play in terms of climate resilience and forest management. So those are our objectives: coordinate, maximize efficiency. There are some programs that just are relying on not so up-to-date protocols, entities that could be talking to each other that are not. There could be some group asks for funding or plant materials and things like that. So this is sort of a programmatic call to action to coordinate everybody and streamline what's already going on, fix up what we got. A huge one, obviously, and again, these are very straightforward. That one's fix up what we got. Goal two is get the people. So we need to develop a reforestation workforce. We need to build capacity by creating new job opportunities and then improving the workforce that we already have, and garner interest in forestry and tree planting and other related careers, so that we can ensure that we'll have future workforce. So parts of that include engaging youth. We love that. We're talking to, 4-H and SUNYs and BOCES and things like that to start on that strategy, and offering more training opportunities for new professionals, for folks who are entering the field. I'm really speeding because I'm looking at that time. Goal three is to scale up plant material production to support reforestation efforts. So, I talked about getting the people. This is about getting the plants. There are some policies and regulations standing in the way of being able to scale up plant material. So for example, the Saratoga Tree Nursery has like a really, really old contract they're working with that says they can't sell liner stock. So that would be a nice programmatic tweak we can make to streamline this plant material pipeline. Develop a seed program. So we don't have a seed program. I talked a little bit about why that would be important to procure, making sure we have the best practices under our belt, the best practices for seed collection and for propagation, and personnel who are aware of those practices, best practices for responding to a changing climate in terms of how you work with the genetics of the species you collect and outplant. And then another one that's really just a call to coordination, strengthening networks and engaging partners. So, you know, building plant material networks where folks can share resources, information, and that's going to span across, agencies like DEC and the state, Saratoga Tree Nursery, nonprofits or other entities like possibly the soil and water districts. We have, the SUNYs are on board and interested in producing some plant material in their greenhouses. And then this looks a little bit cut off, but also jumpstarting the commercial sector. So it's not going to be something we're able to accomplish without tapping into the private sector as well. Um, okay, so we said fix up what we got. Um, people, plants. This one's place. Where are all these trees going to go? So to select best sites and secure landowner support, we want to pretty straightforward again, create a site prioritization framework, see where we can site trees to get the most benefits and have it be the most feasible, or if it's not the most feasible, where it'll be worth it to do something that would be difficult. Um, so we want to maximize benefits and capture opportunity and feasibility across land types. And then, 98% of reforestation opportunity in New York State, as identified by TNC, is on private lands. 75% of New York State's forests are privately owned. So landowner engagement, getting buy-in, and working reforestation into existing social fabric of local communities is going to be really important. And that could be a rabbit hole we could fall down. And then we also want to identify best approaches to successful forest establishment. So we have, all these new elements, the people, the plants, the places. Let's make sure that we really are keeping tabs on, using methods that are known to be effective here and keeping tabs on methods that we're not sure how effective they are and identifying those research gaps and knowledge gaps. So I have here, emphasizing the importance of using right plants in the right places, um, using the right techniques across different land types and project objectives. And then, expanding our portfolio to try new things because we're going to need to be sort of building the plane as we fly it, right? We're going to need to, you know, conduct research and do aggressive monitoring as we use new methods, so that we can, exponentially increase how effective our plantings and our restoration work is as we go forward. That one's one that I think a lot of folks on this call will have really good input on, by the way. And because I mentioned monitoring, we're going to need that really aggressive monitoring to make sure that we are actually identifying what works and what doesn't. In order to do that, we're going to need to be taking a lot of data. And right now, the state of data management capacity and efficiency isn't necessarily where it should be to scale up. So similar to our last goal of work on what we know to be effective and build new where we need to, we're going to want to create new platforms where they don't currently exist, and then also upgrade existing data resources. And so I can talk more about that for the data nerds in the room. But since I just ran through that at the speed of light, I would love to just see what folks' first impressions are if this is your first hearing about this, and address some questions because I already saw some in the chat and I'm ready to talk about all the nuances that are involved in these few slides that I shared. So how was that, Emily? At 32
Fantastic.
minutes. It was a little fast. I was like, geez, I hope everybody else had as much coffee as I did.
There are some questions in the chat. Um, let's see. What tree species stores the most carbon quickly, and what tree species stores the most carbon over time?
Whoa, would that I knew. That would be great information to have. And I'm sure, to be fair, I'm sure that somebody that folks are looking into that. But what's tricky about species is that a lot of folks are asking, like, what species are you going to be planting in order to do this? And we just have such a diversity of land types and then like micro like site types. Even if you're operating in the same county, it's going to be different if, you're like in a tree pit on a sidewalk, versus trying to improve regen in a forest that has some natural regeneration. Um, so we always really steer away from recommending any static lists of species and more talk about the criteria that you want to think about. That said, I think it's really important that you noted that there's a difference between storing the most carbon quickly and storing it over time. So that is essentially the difference between carbon sequestration and carbon storage. And that has, as far as I know, less to do with the species and more to do with the age of the trees. And that's something that you can manage for by site, right? So, so there's, the Young Forest Initiative out of Division of Fish and Wildlife at DC, is aimed at wildlife habitat management, but those young forests are able to sequester carbon really, really well. So they're the best at sequestering carbon because they're building up biomass, as they have this like spike in growth. And if you keep cutting that back, like you would in a wildlife habitat sort of management scenario, then you'll keep getting good carbon sequestration. So that's attractive for the storing carbon quickly, right? And then for storing it over time, that's our mature forests where, you know, those trees, if your objective is to establish a forest that grows in perpetuity and has these huge giant trees that are there in 100 years, um, then they'll grow or sequester carbon quickly as they grow at first, and then bottom out once they get to maturity. But then those trees are or storing more carbon than all the little ones from before, right? So that's when you want to make sure that when those are harvested, they're turned into durable wood products or something like that, um, because they're storing so much carbon in the long term. So it comes down to sort of like how you want to manage the forest. And the best thing to do, I think, for reforestation is to make sure that once you establish that forest, you're just continuing to manage it at all. You can choose one option or the other. But I think, you know, at a baseline, just making a decision and planning for the long term is the key to carbon. Did any of that make sense?
I think it did.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kevin. That was a great question.
Kevin had one other question that he had put in the chat. Is the Saratoga Tree Nursery able to grow sufficient tree stock to meet New York State's needs to meet the 2033 goal?
Definitely not. Nope. Um, but we are super excited to get the renovations underway at Saratoga Tree Nursery because right now they do amazing work there right now with this very outdated facility and very few staff. I believe they crank out around like 1 million seedlings a year. Um, so they estimated that once they have the renovations completed, they'll be able to ramp that up to closer to 6 to 8 million a year. Um, and some of those renovations are really obvious. They have really small buildings. They have equipment that, is from like the 60s or infrastructure from the 40s or the 1910s just kicking around. So they should be able to ramp up easily once those renovations take place. But the renovations, obviously, a huge project like that takes a really long time. So not only do we have this temporal gap where we need to start ramping up in other ways um, before the 2033 deadline, but in addition to that, 8 million a year isn't going to do it either. Especially when every agency, and organization has sort of their own version of how they want to contribute to this. There's already, I'm sure folks on the call have already experienced, starting a planting project, going to find the plant material, and inevitably having to, outsource that from another state or another region. So we're looking at ways to collaborate with. Um, I mentioned the SUNYs that have greenhouses that have growing programs where they're teaching students how to grow plants. A lot of those folks are on board to help propagate, produce tree seedlings. Department of Corrections also has sort of similar horticultural growing programs. I believe there's 17 correctional facilities in the state that have greenhouses, so they're just there to grow stuff anyway. So they were an entity that was willing to help out. And then it's going to be pretty crucial to loop in the private sector with contracts that make sense, either because they're advanced, look at the long term, or nurseries feel supported in some way by maybe state agencies or other organizations to like incur the risk of scaling up. So that's the short answer. But yeah, it's going to take a whole network, I think, of producers for sure.
And then I think you already answered this while you were just answering that question, but can tree nurseries from adjacent states supply trees to New York State?
Yeah, well, they certainly do as of right now. And so I actually asked a handful of agencies that I was already in contact with for the reforestation plan that I know do a lot of planting. Um, and that included, DEP and New York City parks and state parks and just folks that I knew were regularly doing a lot of planting. And they gave me some of the names of nurseries that they sourced from. And I don't think any of them were in New York State, um, because we just don't have the capacity right now. So that's the current situation. And if we do want to, get started on these goals, then we're probably going to continue supporting um, that industry, even if it's not within New York State. But we've had more recent conversations about the need to establish. There are some existing plant networks that include New York State, but possibly establishing a more robust New York State plant material production network, and then possibly providing some incentive where possible to choose New York State producers over others. So that's kind of in its as a concept in its first phases. But right now there's not really an incentive to pivot to New York State production. And the plants aren't there. So
Thanks, JJ. We are going to wrap
yeah.
up here. Just wanted to say thank you. And if there are any additional questions, we're going to post the link for the reforestation site as well as JJ's contact information with the video once that goes up on the USC website and the Facebook page. I did want to bring your attention to next week's session. We're going to have Brian Heffron from SUNY Cobleskill talking about the yellow lamp mussel. So that will be on November 13th at 9:30. Thank you, everybody, for joining today.
Thanks everyone for having me.